Travel used to be a doorway to the world, but by 2025, for Americans, many of those doors are slamming shut. From the beaches of Cuba to the temples of Iran, from the mountains of Myanmar to the squares of Russia, all have become no-go zones. Why have 10 countries simultaneously said no? The answer lies in politics, conflict, and the ever-deepening fractures of a divided world, when the American passport is no longer the global key. There was a time when simply holding a passport bearing the image of the Statue of Liberty meant you could enter almost any country in the world without worry. The American passport was once a symbol of power, freedom, and global curiosity. But by 2025, that image is fading, not because of smudged entry stamps, but because the doors of the world are slowly closing on the very citizens who were once the most warmly welcomed. The decline in freedom of movement didn't happen overnight. It's the result of decades of hardline diplomacy, prolonged wars, and an international approach that always put the U.S. at the center, whether celebrated or resented. For over 70 years, America has been both the architect of global order and the cause of countless fractures. Alliances were built on democratic ideals, but many nations felt burdened by the overwhelming shadow of Washington. By 2025, what once occurred only in United Nations debates or G7 summits is now playing out clearly at airport check-in counters. A growing list of countries no longer accepts American citizens, and it's not because the U.S. has grown weaker. It's because the world has begun learning how to push back. North Korea, the first name on the list, comes as no surprise, but the core of the story isn't that the country is always closed, but that it chose the year 2024 to make a symbolic statement. Americans are not welcome. This wasn't simply the decision of an isolated state. It was a political response to years of sanctions and Western attempts at control. As the U.S. increased pressure on Pyongyang's nuclear program, the answer didn't come from the negotiation table. It came from the border. No tickets issued from the United States. What makes this decision significant isn't the number of affected tourists, which is very small, but the message behind it. The world no longer sees Americans as neutral travelers. They are labeled by a history of military intervention, intelligence operations around the globe, and a long-held belief that where Americans go, things change in the way they want. For countries like North Korea, controlling who enters and exits is central to preserving identity, power, and sovereignty. And the American passport, a symbol of an ideology, is now the first to be restricted. But the issue doesn't stop with North Korea. The bigger question is, why, by 2025, have more and more countries, from the Middle East to Eastern Europe, from fragile democracies to military regimes, decided to shut their doors to American citizens? The answer lies in a redefinition of the world order. While the U.S. struggles with internal divisions, political instability, and waning trust from its allies, many nations are seeking a new balance of power by distancing themselves from American influence. Banning Americans from entry isn't just a security measure. It's a diplomatic move, a way to assert a stance, send a signal to the world, and sometimes to rally internal unity by choosing an external target as psychological leverage. From that ban comes a reverse ripple. Travel companies pull out of markets, flights get canceled, global tourism revenues drop, and people, both American and local, lose one of the most valuable opportunities: to understand and to be understood. In this context, a country banning American citizens is no longer the exception. It's the sign of a trend. The world is learning to say no to the old power. And those Americans holding what was once the world's most powerful passport must now face a new reality. They are no longer universally welcomed global travelers. They are citizens of a country being reevaluated, questioned, and in some cases, rejected. This isn't just about tourism. It's a geopolitical equation that America and the entire world must now solve, with footsteps that are increasingly restricted. Russia. When the cold no longer comes only from the weather. If North Korea closes its doors in the shadow of isolation, then Russia does so under the spotlight of the global stage, with all the openness, coldness, and calculated moves of a carefully orchestrated political chess game. The ban on U.S. citizens entering in 2024 is not just an ordinary administrative order. It is a symbolic break between two powers that have long coexisted, confronted, and intertwined in a relationship marked by entanglement and suspicion throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. There was a time when American tourists came to Russia with curious eyes, eager to marvel at the golden domes of the Kremlin, enjoy a ballet night at the Bolshoi, or simply walk down the wide boulevards of Moscow with a feeling both strange and mysterious. But in 2025, no one crosses those borders anymore, at least not those holding American passports. Russia-U.S. relations have never truly been friendly, but amidst tensions, there existed what people called a diplomatic line. That line was erased in 2024, when Moscow announced it would stop issuing visas to all U.S. citizens. The announcement came without lengthy explanations, just one repeated phrase: national security. But behind that excuse lies a massive iceberg of simmering conflicts, accusations of election interference, cyber warfare, economic sanctions, energy crises, and most notably, the war in Ukraine. The biggest fracture that shattered every remaining diplomatic effort. As the U.S. provided military and financial aid to Kyiv, and Russia declared it would push back Western influence, the rejection of American citizens was no longer a defensive move. It was a clear political message. We do not need your presence, in any form. What's more striking is that Russia didn't just ban specific groups, like journalists, diplomats, or NGOs, but everyone. Americans wanting to revisit places their grandparents fled after the World Wars, hoping to trace ancestral roots in the Caucasus, or simply admire the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, were all flatly denied. Personal dreams swept away by political storms they didn't create, and that leaves a quiet wound in many hearts. Many Russian Americans have expressed disappointment, even heartbreak. Born in California, raised in Texas, but still speaking Russian with their grandmother every night over Zoom. And now, they can't fly to a place that's just one plane ticket away, a red line they cannot cross. The impact isn't only on tourists, but on Russians themselves. In 2023, more than 300,000 Americans visited Russia, contributing hundreds of millions of dollars to the tourism industry. With the ban, service sectors in Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kazan, and Sochi have had to pivot to Asian or Middle Eastern markets, promising but not yet able to fill the cultural gap left by Western visitors. Luxury hotels now sit half-empty, English-speaking tour guides change professions, and the once vibrant spaces that bridged East and West now fall silent, colder than even the Siberian winter. But deeper still is the growing sense. America's retreat from parts of the world map didn't come from their own choice, but from the rejection of those who once viewed them with wary eyes. Russia didn't ban America because America is weak. Russia banned America because it no longer accepts an international order centered around the U.S. In that context, Americans are not just restricted in movement. They are stripped of the right to observe the world from within. They become outsiders, reading news about a distant Russia, a place they once thought they'd return to someday. And perhaps the most concerning thing isn't losing a travel destination. It's losing a channel of dialogue, a chance to understand one another, a sliver of light in the darkness of global conflict. When Americans are no longer allowed into Russia, and Russians no longer want them there, Then silence will no longer be a foreign policy. It will be the new normal. Iran. When ancient pathways turn into political crossroads. If Russia closes its doors with the coldness of strategy and power, then Iran withdraws in silence, like a gatekeeper of history, long accustomed to being viewed with suspicion. The ban on American citizens entering in 2024 did not come as a shock, but it did make the world pause and reflect. Why would a country carrying 1,000 years of civilization, a nation that once rolled out red carpets for Western visitors in the ancient bazaars of Isfahan, now tighten every entry point as if trying to erase all traces of one nation, the United States, from its soil? No other country in the Middle East has a more complex relationship with America than Iran. It's not just a political standoff, it's a series of fractured memories. From the 1953 U.S.-backed coup, to the 1979 hostage crisis, to numerous rounds of sanctions, nuclear negotiations, broken promises, and shattered trust. For Iran, every handshake with the U.S. is a deeply divisive internal debate, and every sign of concession can become a pretext for hardliners to tighten their grip on power. So, when relations between the two countries hit one of their lowest points in 2024, with escalating disputes over nuclear programs, pressure from new sanctions, and ongoing cyber attacks, Tehran's decision to ban American citizens was no longer a reactive measure, but a declaration. We will not let you in, both literally and symbolically. For many Americans, especially those who once dreamed of visiting Persepolis, dining in a historic house in Shiraz, or wandering through the luminous mosques of Qom, this is a cultural loss that cannot be easily replaced. Because Iran is unlike any other place. It's where you can touch marble etched with the names of kings from 2,500 years ago, and a few hours later be listening to Hafez's poetry in a garden scented with pomegranate blossoms. What makes this ban particularly heartbreaking is that Iran is not only beautiful, it has also been more welcoming to American visitors than people realize. Many Americans have shared stories of the astonishing hospitality of Iranians, warm handshakes, and the phrase, "Welcome to Iran," echoing on every street corner. But now, instead of that greeting, there is an invisible wall of politics, dividing gazes, stifling understanding. The impact of the ban goes beyond tourism. It chokes off people-to-people exchanges that once helped ease tensions between the two nations. From educational programs, academic partnerships, to cultural and humanitarian exchanges. Professors who dreamed of lecturing at the University of Tehran, American researchers wanting to study Shia Islam at its intellectual center in Qom, all are now denied access. And in that picture, science, culture, and human connection once again become hostages of politics. Inside Iran, the absence of American visitors also leaves a quiet void, not just of money, but of outside perspectives, of being heard by others, of telling one's own story without the Western lens. Iranian artists who once relied on international galleries now must shift to domestic markets. Tourism workers in Yazd or Kashan, once vibrant with English conversations, now hear only the wind and the sound of sun-baked bricks. On the other side, Americans also lose the chance to see Iran beyond the news headlines. Not through the images of the axis of evil, radical Islam, or nuclear reactors, but through hijab-wearing mothers kindly offering tea, through outdoor weddings with old Gugush songs, through bronze-colored sunsets over the Lut Desert. And that's why Iran's decision to ban Americans is not just the act of a tense nation. It is a defensive reflex of a people long exhausted by being misunderstood, sanctioned, and cut off. And in that empty space, dialogue no longer exists. Only imagined versions of each other shaped by outdated stereotypes. Will the door open again someday? Maybe, but if not, then the walls dividing Iran and the U.S. will not only be policy, they will become gaps in memory and perception. And eventually, a generation of Americans will grow up never knowing Iran, except for two words: off-limits. Cuba. When salsa notes turn into political silence. If Iran is a land of ancient roads, shadowed by nuclear tension and suspicion, then Cuba is an unfinished melody, a tune that once nearly came back to life, now silenced once again by the screech of politics and prejudice. In 2024, when the Cuban government announced a ban on American tourists, it wasn't just the closing of a border, it was the folding shut of a chapter of hope opened less than a decade ago. For Americans, Cuba isn't a geographically distant destination. It's just over 150 kilometers from Florida. But politically, that distance spans generations. Since the 1959 revolution and events like the 1962 missile crisis, prolonged trade embargoes, and decades of systematic anti-Americanism, Cuba became a symbol of ideological resistance during the Cold War era. Resilient, fierce, and at times, alone. Yet within that seemingly unchanging space, there was once a soft moment. In 2016, under the Obama administration, the two countries re-established diplomatic relations after more than 50 years of frozen ties. The first commercial flights resumed, embassies reopened, and Americans who had only read about Cuba in books could now see Havana with their own eyes, a city aged yet beautiful, like a forgotten dream. The pastel-colored vintage cars, the sound of tres guitars on street corners, the old men playing dominoes in courtyards, all became symbols of an open, human Cuba. But that hope didn't last. The U.S. government later reversed course, reimposed sanctions, restricted financial transactions, and returned Cuba to the list of state sponsors of terrorism. In Havana's eyes, this wasn't just a turning of the back, it was another round of imposition, suspicion, and a shove back into defensive mode. So in 2024, Cuba responded not with words, but with action, ending the reception of tourists carrying U.S. passports. For Cubans, it was a bitter decision. Tourism isn't just a source of income, it's the lifeblood that sustains the island amid chronic shortages. The absence of American tourists, those who once brought cash, medicine, gifts, and empathy, left many Cuban families without a livelihood. Homes once renovated into homestays, vintage taxi drivers, live bands hired by Havana bars, now all face extended silence. From the American side, the decision not only removed a nearby destination, but also severed one of the few channels of dialogue between two societies riddled with misunderstanding. Many Americans, especially younger generations, once traveled to Cuba to learn, to question long-held assumptions, and to witness a real Cuba. Not just a political symbol, but a country of people, families, and everyday dreams. More than politics, Cuba was once a human lesson for Americans, a place where those labeled as enemies could sincerely offer you a mojito, a place where you'd find a doctor driving a taxi to support his children, a teacher playing music on the roadside. Contradictions that made American visitors reflect deeply upon returning home. Now, cruise ships no longer dock at Havana's port. Photos from the Malecon, the Caribbean's most romantic seaside promenade, remain only as memories on Instagram. And in the heart of Miami, home to the largest Cuban diaspora in the world, news of the ban spreads like a fresh wound, stinging but unsurprising. For Cuba, this isn't the first time it has lived in isolation. But what makes the present moment different is that it once tasted the light, and now must return to darkness. For Americans, losing Cuba isn't just losing a travel destination. It's the loss of a chance to break the cycle of confrontation, misunderstanding, and stereotype. The question is, when can a cut-off song begin to play again? Will there be a day when salsa music rings out once more to welcome guests at Jose Marti International Airport? No one knows for sure. But until then, Cuba, with all its beauty, contradictions, and historical depth, will still be there, waiting for the door to open again. And maybe next time, the one knocking won't come for political reasons, but simply because they want to understand. Venezuela. When green forests become political borders. No crisis in South America has sparked as much controversy and international division as Venezuela. A country once called the oil jewel of the region has now become a symbol of the collapse of an entire economic system and of self-imposed political isolation. In 2024, when the Caracas government officially issued an entry ban on American citizens, it wasn't simply a reactionary move. It marked the end of a diplomatic chapter steeped in sanctions, suspicion, and broken trust that had lasted more than 2 decades. Unlike Iran or Cuba, where confrontations with the U.S. played out in clearly defined ideological spaces, Venezuela's story is more complicated and more tragic. Once boasting the highest per capita GDP in the region, free healthcare, gasoline cheaper than water, and one of the highest literacy rates in Latin America, Venezuela collapsed not due to war, but because of a spiral of inflation, policy failures, and the paralysis of an entire state apparatus. In that context, the U.S. was no longer a distant friend, but a close rival, through sanctions, support for the opposition, and countless efforts to reshape the country's political future. The 2024 travel ban came as a final checkpoint after years of warnings, tension, and severed ties. The Nicolas Maduro government, long accusing the U.S. of meddling in Venezuela's politics, declared that barring American citizens was necessary for national security and the integrity of sovereignty. In reality, this move was a clear sign of a nation tightening the protective circle around an increasingly fragile seat of power. But behind that decision are thousands of lives divided, from Venezuelan American citizens wanting to visit family, to oil engineers once stationed in Maracaibo, to humanitarian volunteers bringing medicine and hope. All are denied, not because of any wrongdoing, but because they carry the wrong passport at the wrong time. Borders now are not just rivers, mountains, or checkpoints, but the navy blue passport cover. We must also mention the NGOs that have long tried to keep ties with Venezuela, despite all risks: vaccination teams, food aid experts, UN missions monitoring the distribution of relief supplies. Many included Americans, and now they are entirely excluded from the scene, meaning Venezuela has lost part of its capacity to rescue itself from within. For American travelers who once hoped to explore Venezuela, this is a loss hard to quantify. Few know that this country holds some of the planet's most breathtaking natural wonders. Angel Falls, the world's tallest waterfall, the cloud forests of Gran Sabana, the turquoise beaches of Los Roques, and mighty plateaus seemingly forgotten by time. Venezuela is not just a crisis, it is a forgotten beauty. And now even the chance to witness that forgotten beauty has been completely blocked. Right in the heart of Caracas, a capital once buzzing with colonial architecture and bohemian-style cafes, hotels that used to welcome Americans have closed their upper floors, downsized staff, and turned to local marketing or tourism from Russia, Iran, and China. Signs reading "Aceptamos dólares" that once signaled welcome have been replaced with "Solo pago móvil." Flight maps showing routes to New York, Miami, and Houston now gather dust in shuttered travel agencies. But perhaps the saddest truth is this: no one is surprised anymore. Venezuela being cut off from the U.S. travel map no longer causes the shock it once might have. Because the world has grown used to bridges becoming fractures. The feeling of isolation for both Americans and Venezuelans has become the norm. And so only one question remains. When will both sides stop seeing each other as enemies and begin to see each other as people? Because if that doesn't happen, then it's not just borders that will remain closed, but the very best parts of what once connected the two nations will be forever forgotten in the shadows of politics and poverty. Libya. When question marks on the map become bans without reason. There are countries that disappear from travel lists, not because they close themselves off, but because they have shattered into pieces that cannot be reassembled. Libya is one of them. In 2024, when the interim government in Tripoli, which controls only a small portion of the territory, issued an entry ban for U.S. citizens, hardly anyone was surprised. But this was not a routine decision. It was the sigh of a nation sinking deep into crisis, no longer able to hold on to anything, not even hope from the outside. Unlike Cuba or Venezuela, where bans carry political confrontation tones, Libya does not ban because the U.S. is an enemy. It bans because it can no longer control what happens within its borders. A once prosperous country with the highest living standards in Africa is now fragmented under the control of armed groups, religious militias, mercenaries, and self-proclaimed governments. In this chaos, the presence of U.S. citizens, whether tourists, journalists, aid workers, or diplomats, becomes a dangerous burden rather than support. Since the death of leader Gaddafi in 2011, Libya has never truly had a unified government. In the years that followed, the country continuously became a battlefield for civil wars, power struggles, and international interventions. The U.S., as an external force, has been involved in diplomatic efforts, counter-terrorism campaigns, and airstrikes, but also as a subject of suspicion, hatred, and sometimes a pretext for extremist groups to justify kidnappings or attacks. Therefore, when the 2024 ban was issued, it was not just a defensive move. It was Libya's way of telling the world that it could no longer ensure safety, even for its own people. And for Americans, they became the most flammable flag in any power struggle among armed factions occupying areas from Benghazi to Saba. Perhaps few remember that Libya once had unique cultural heritage. The ancient city of Leptis Magna, with majestic Roman ruins in the desert. The Mediterranean coastline, stretching with crystal-clear waters. Ancient Berber villages carved into mountainsides. Many scholars, archaeologists, and American tourists were once passionate about exploring the glorious and multi-layered past of this land. But all has now sunk into the sands. The relics that once testified to East-West exchanges are now abandoned, destroyed, or controlled by unidentified armed groups. Worse, Libya is now not just a failed state, but a blank spot in all global support systems. No direct flights from the U.S., no embassy. No international aid agency maintains a long-term presence. In a world where technology can take you anywhere in an instant, Libya has become a black dot, not because it's far, but because it's too dangerous to approach. Wikipedia. Behind this is the tragedy of Americans who once had ties to Libya. Volunteer doctors who participated in humanitarian programs in Misrata. Journalists who followed the collapse of a regime and hoped to witness reconstruction. American veterans who once fought here and carry post-war trauma about a land that never stabilizes. Now, they can only watch from afar, as the place they once set foot in spirals downward uncontrollably, unable to do anything. The question is not when Libya will reopen to U.S. citizens, but when Libya will have enough unity to have the authority to close or open any door. Because today's ban is not just a sovereign decision. It is a sign that this nation has lost itself, U.S. Department of the Treasury. And while the world continues to talk about geopolitical no-go zones, Libya is where that becomes the harshest reality. A land that can no longer control who enters, so it chooses to let no one in, especially those with U.S. citizenship, who represent support, oversight, and sometimes intervention. A passport that once opened every door now becomes a dangerous sign in a land without law. Libya is no longer a place to explore. It is a warning of what happens when a nation not only fractures politically, but also fractures the very concept of nationhood. And in that fracture, Americans, once on the front lines, can now only stand and watch from a great distance. Yemen. When invitations for tea become memories, buried in smoke and fire. There are places that were once the cradle of civilization, now turned into the dark corners of humanity. Yemen is one such place. The land of frankincense, mocha coffee, and ancient stone mountains once attracted scholars, travelers, and Western explorers. But in 2024, Yemen officially closed its doors to U.S. citizens, a decision not made to assert power, but to acknowledge the helplessness of a nation gradually falling into an abyss. For centuries, Yemen was a crossroads of great cultures. Cities like Sana'a, with their unique mud brick tower architecture, were once recognized by UNESCO as World Heritage Sites. The Yemeni people, despite living in poverty, were renowned for their hospitality, with traditions of offering tea and sharing meals even with strangers. But since the civil war erupted in 2015, the country has plunged into an unending series of tragedies. Bombings, disease, famine, and divisions reaching every corner of society. The 2024 ban on American entry is essentially a defensive message. We cannot protect you, and we cannot allow you to become a pretext for further fueling the flames of war. In a country where each territory has its own ruling authority, where armed groups control airports, seaports, and supply routes, controlling the flow of people, especially those holding U.S. passports, has become impossible. They may be kidnapped, detained, exploited, or used as political bargaining tools in the brutal conflict among factions. Americans are no longer permitted to set foot in Yemen, but they also have no reason to, beyond compassion. Tourism has long vanished. Those who once came to Yemen for humanitarian work, war reporting, or international medical missions can now only follow the situation through news reports and sporadic calls from colleagues still stationed in dangerous areas. Yemen's tragedy doesn't lie in whom they ban, but in the fact that they must ban everyone. The nation no longer has the strength to open its heart, lacks the resources to welcome, and more importantly, has no safe space to keep anyone, even for a few hours. The ban on Americans is akin to a choked confession. We can no longer govern our own territory. For many Americans who have been to Yemen, especially during the post-9/11 period when the country was seen as a secondary front in the war on terror, this is a personal loss. Many veterans, doctors, and social activists still vividly remember the faces they once helped. The villages nestled in lush valleys where children played amidst ruins as if there were no war. But now, if they return, they may never come back. One cannot ignore the pain of the Yemeni American community, especially in cities like Dearborn, Michigan, or Brooklyn, New York, where many immigrants from this country reside. They witness their homeland sinking into violence, while the U.S. government, where they now live, is seen as a party involved in the chaos. The ban on traveling to Yemen also means they cannot return to bury their fathers, visit their mothers, or simply set foot on the land that gave them birth. Yemen was once a promised land, not a promise of wealth, but a promise of a more humane, profound, and culturally rich Middle East than what the news often portrays. But all that now exists only in memory. The tall mud brick houses have collapsed, the mocha coffee trees broken under the rain of bullets, and the invitations for tea, once a symbol of hospitality, are now forever silenced by the sound of bombs. Americans no longer come to Yemen, not because they don't want to, but because Yemen is no longer a place that can receive anyone. That ban is not a security barrier, but the end of the concept of being welcomed in a country once proud of its hospitality more than any other resource. And that is the most heartbreaking thing.